Teslyn Elizabeth O'Cole was born on June 8, 1994 in California. She was born to a very young mother, Stella Kaiser, who was only 16 years old at the time of her birth. And shockingly, this was not her first child. This early motherhood would prove to be a significant factor in the events that occurred in the little girl's life. Teslyn had an older brother named Jason who was about 2 years older than her. The family's living situation in California was unstable, with Stella and Jason's father residing in Ontario for a period. This instability would become a recurring theme in Teslyn's life, as her family moved between different locations and living arrangements. Despite the challenges of her early life, Teslyn was described by those who knew her as a vibrant and loving child. She had a particular fondness for animals, especially horses, dogs, and cats. This love for animals was a defining characteristic of her personality, showcasing her gentle and caring nature even at such a young age. She also enjoyed creative activities, with drawing being one of her favorite hobbies. This interest in art might have been an early indication of her imaginative and expressive nature. In early 1997, when Teslyn was around 2.5 years old, a significant change occurred in her life. Stella made the decision to move from California to Oregon. This move was reportedly motivated by Stella's desire to escape from her tumultuous relationship with Jason's father. According to Teslyn's uncle Billy Kaiser, who was Stella's twin brother, the relationship between Stella and Jason's father was unhealthy, necessitating this drastic change in their living situation. The move to Oregon was initially seen as a positive step for Stella and her children. Upon arriving there, Stella renewed her bond with her twin brother Billy, which provided her with some familial support in her new environment. In an effort to improve her life and parenting skills, she took the commendable step of enrolling in a parenting class. This action suggested that Stella was making a genuine attempt to better herself and create a better environment for her children. However, the family's stability was short-lived. In December 1996, just a few months after moving to Oregon, Stella took her children to visit the O'Cole family in California for Christmas. It was during this visit that a significant change occurred in the family dynamic. When it was time to return to Oregon, Stella made the decision to leave her son Jason, who was about 4 years old at the time, with the O'Coles in California. This separation greatly upset Teslyn. Upon returning to Oregon in January 1997, Stella was now a single mother with only Teslyn in her care. It was at this point that her life took another dramatic turn. That same month, Stella met Jesse Caleb Compton, a 20-year-old man who would soon play a devastating role in Teslyn's life. The relationship between Stella and Jesse Compton progressed rapidly. By early March 1997, Stella and Teslyn had moved into Compton's apartment in Springfield, Oregon. This quick progression of the relationship and cohabitation would have been another significant change for young Teslyn, who was now living with a man she had only known for a short time. Jesse's apartment was described as dirty and malodorous. The living conditions were far from ideal for a child. The apartment had numerous holes in the walls, which Compton had made by punching them when he was angry or by throwing knives. This detail provides insight into Compton's volatile temperament and the unsafe environment that Teslyn was now living in. To make matters worse, she quickly became the target of Compton's violent and sadistic behavior, which was exacerbated by drug use and enabled by her mother's inaction. The abuse began with physical violence. Compton would hit Teslyn on her butt and back using various objects, including a wooden spoon, a spatula, and a belt. These beatings were not isolated incidents, but became a regular occurrence in the household. Visitors to the apartment witnessed Compton slapping Teslyn in the face. Compton's mistreatment extended beyond hitting. Psychological abuse was also a significant component of Teslyn's mishandling. Compton frequently forced her to stand in the corner for extended periods. This form of punishment, especially when imposed on a child as young as Teslyn, can be psychologically damaging, instilling feelings of isolation, shame, and fear. Compton was often angry with Teslyn and called her disparaging names, further contributing to her emotional trauma. Another disturbing aspect of the abuse involved forcing Teslyn to take long, cold baths or showers. The abuse took on a more sinister nature during the frequent drug parties hosted by Compton in the apartment. These parties, some of which lasted for several days, created an environment of chaos and neglect. During these events, Teslin was usually kept confined to the bedroom. Witnesses reported hearing her cry for hours after Compton had been in the bedroom with her. This detail suggests that some of the most severe abuse may have occurred behind closed doors, away from the eyes of others. Disturbingly, Compton would not allow anyone to enter the bedroom to help or comfort the girl. As time progressed, Teslin's isolation increased. Compton and Stella began keeping her in the bedroom most of the time, further cutting her off from any potential sources of help or comfort. The mistreatment unfortunately escalated into unimaginable acts of cruelty as time progressed. In a shocking act of violence, Compton broke 4 vertebrae in Teslin's back. This injury alone would have severely impaired the child's mobility and caused her constant pain, yet it was just the beginning of the escalating abuse she would endure. Following this severe spinal injury, Compton's abuse turned sexual. He forcefully penetrated Teslin's vagina with an object, subjecting the 3-year-old to horrific abuse. One of the most horrifying aspects of the escalated abuse involved the use of a propane torch. Compton inflicted large, gaping burns on Teslin's back, butt, and genitals using an open flame. These burns were severe and extensive, causing significant damage to the child's small body. Furthermore, some of these burns became infected. The infection of these wounds would have caused additional pain and distress, potentially leading to systemic health issues. In a twisted attempt to treat the infected burns, Compton poured rubbing alcohol into them. This action would have caused further excruciating pain. In addition to the larger burns, Compton also inflicted smaller round burns on Teslin's legs. These injuries suggest a pattern of change to using the torch as a recurring go-to form of torture or punishment. The escalation of abuse reached new heights in the 2 weeks leading up to Teslin's death. During this period, Compton began subjecting Teslin to a particularly cruel form of restraint. He would immobilize her by placing her hands over her head and pulling her feet up over her shoulders, then tying them together with ropes, cords, or strips of cloth. This painful position, which essentially folded Teslin's body in half. Compton used this method of treatment 10 to 15 times during this 2-week period. Each time, he would leave her tied up for 8 to 10 hours. At one point, he struck her in the head several times, causing bruising to her brain. In a bizarre act, Compton scraped and bruised Teslin's abdomen with a fork. This unusual form of abuse seems to serve no purpose other than to inflict additional pain and suffering on the already gravely injured child. Fast forward to June 14, 1997, Teslin ultimately succumbed to the vast torture she had sustained over the last couple of months. On the night of June 13th or early morning of June 14th, Jesse Compton discovered the girl's lifeless body in the bedroom of their apartment. Upon finding Teslin unresponsive, Compton attempted various methods to revive her. He cut her loose from the restraints that had bound her hands and feet and then performed CPR but was unsuccessful. In desperation, he struck the child several times in the left side of her chest with his fist. When this also failed to resuscitate her, Compton resorted to using a frayed electrical cord, applying it directly to her chest in an apparent attempt to shock her back to life. Finally, he splashed cold water on her body in another futile effort to revive her, but obviously none of that worked. Faced with reality and fearing legal consequences, Compton and Stella made a despicable and frustrating decision. They would conceal what had happened rather than seek help or report her death. They left Teslin's body in the bedroom while they planned their next steps. Both were acutely aware that if anyone saw the body and the injuries, they would likely face immediate arrest and prosecution. Eventually, the couple decided to bury Teslin's body to hide their crimes. They enlisted the help of Compton's sister in carrying out this plan. On June 15, 1997, the three drove to a remote area near Sweet Home, Oregon. There, they dug a shallow grave near a logging road and placed the remains inside it. Alongside her remains were items that would later be recovered as evidence. This included a piece of cloth torn from a curtain, strips of gray fabric used as restraints, a blue braided belt, and a woman's ring with a pink stone. The act of burying Teslin did not seem to weigh heavily on Compton or Stella. In the days following her burial, witnesses described their behavior as disturbingly carefree. The couple appeared happy and affectionate with one another, almost as if nothing tragic had occurred. They told friends that Teslin was either staying with a babysitter or visiting Stella's aunt. They even spoke about their future plans, including moving out of town and having another child. This facade continued until June 16th when Compton's sister went to the Springfield Police Department and revealed what had happened. She confessed that she had helped bury Teslin 2 days earlier near Sweet Home. Early on June 17th, police officers followed her directions to the burial site. There, they unearthed Teslin's battered body from the grave. Following the recovery of the remains, detectives began by interviewing individuals who had been in contact with the culprits. They sought information about any signs of abuse or neglect that may have been observed by friends, family members, or neighbors. Some neighbors recalled hearing Teslin cry for extended periods during parties hosted by Compton. Others mentioned seeing Compton physically discipline Teslin in ways that raised alarms but did not lead to immediate intervention. Despite these observations, there had been no formal reports made to CPS or law enforcement prior to Teslin's death. Afterward, authorities obtained permission to search through Compton's apartment. Upon entering the residence, officers were struck by its filthy condition and foul odor. As they searched, police discovered various items that corroborated their suspicions about ongoing drug use and child neglect within the home. They found drug paraphernalia consistent with amphetamine use scattered throughout the apartment. This included remnants from drug preparation processes such as propane torches, alongside bottles of rubbing alcohol. In addition to these items, officers discovered strips of cloth similar to those found at Teslin's burial site. Ultimately, both Jesse Compton and Stella Kaiser were arrested. Compton was indicted on 6 counts of aggravated murder, murder by abuse, first-degree sexual penetration, and second-degree abuse of a corpse. His trial began in late 1997. Compton's defense team attempted to portray him as a victim of his own troubled background and addiction. They also tried to shift some blame onto Stella, arguing that she was equally responsible for Teslin's care. Despite these efforts, the jury found Compton guilty on all counts. Following the conviction, the penalty phase of the trial began, during which the jury was tasked with determining whether Compton should receive the death penalty. After considering aggravating and mitigating factors, the jury recommended the death sentence, which the judge imposed. Stella's legal journey was more complex, involving 2 separate trials. Her first trial began in January 1999. Her defense team argued that she suffered from mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from childhood trauma. They contended that these factors, combined with her drug addiction and fear of Compton, prevented her from fully comprehending or acting on the abuse Teslin was suffering. This first trial ended in a mistrial due to a hung jury, with jurors unable to reach a unanimous decision on Stella's culpability. Her second trial began in April 1999, less than 3 months after the first. This time, the prosecution's case was more focused, emphasizing Stella's role in allowing and concealing the abuse. They argued that to be convicted of aggravated murder, Stella didn't need to have inflicted the injuries herself, but only to have intentionally aided Compton in torturing Teslin. After deliberation, the jury in the second trial found Stella guilty on all counts. On May 7, 1999, Kaiser was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of her daughter. Elisa Izquierdo's story begins in the late 1980s, in Brooklyn, New York. She was born on February 11, 1989, and unfortunately, she also faced difficult circumstances right from the start. Her parents, Gustavo and Ewilda, came from diverse backgrounds. Gustavo was a Cuban immigrant who had come to the United States with aspirations of becoming a dance teacher. Ewilda, on the other hand, was of Puerto Rican descent. Their paths crossed in an unlikely setting, the Fort Greene homeless shelter in Brooklyn. At the time of their meeting, Gustavo was employed part-time at the shelter, while Ewilda was a temporary resident. Ewilda was struggling with a severe substance addiction during her pregnancy with Elisa. This drug abuse had dire consequences for the unborn child. The impact of the substance use was immediately apparent. Elisa's condition at birth necessitated immediate intervention from social services. The city's Child Welfare Administration was notified of her condition on the very day of her birth, marking the first of many interactions Elisa would have with the child welfare system throughout her short life. Given the evident addiction issues plaguing Elisa's mother, the authorities made the decision to award full custody of the newborn to her father, Gustavo. This decision would prove to be a great one. Under Gustavo's care, Elisa thrived. From the moment Gustavo gained custody of his daughter, he dedicated himself to providing her with the best possible upbringing. Despite his limited resources and lack of parenting experience, Gustavo's love for his daughter was evident in every aspect of their daily life. He created a nurturing environment that allowed Elisa's natural talents and personality to flourish. When Elisa was just 1 year old, he made the decision to enroll her in a Montessori preschool program at the local YWCA. At this school, Elisa quickly stood out. Her teachers were impressed by her quick mind, her eagerness to learn, and her sunny disposition. Phyllis Bryce, the school's director, would later recall Elisa as a child of extraordinary potential. She was beautiful, radiant, Bryce said. She had an inner strength and a lot of potential for growth. In fact, one individual known as Prince Michael from Greece, who was a patron of the school, took note of Elisa and pledged to finance Elisa's entire private school education all the way to 12th grade. Fast forward to around the time Elisa turned 4, Gustavo began to make plans for her future education. With Prince Michael's generous offer in mind, Gustavo started researching private schools in the area. He dreamed of Elisa attending a top-tier institution where her intellect and talents could be fully nurtured. However, as Elisa's 5th year approached, shadows began to creep into her otherwise bright childhood. The court-mandated visitations with her mother were becoming increasingly problematic. Elisa would often return from these visits withdrawn and anxious, a stark contrast to her usually bubbly personality. Gustavo noticed changes in his daughter's behavior that concerned him deeply. She began to have nightmares and would sometimes wet the bed, behaviors she had previously outgrown. At times, she would become clingy and fearful, especially when it was time for her visits with Awilda. But before that, it's important to note that Awilda seemed to be making progress in bettering herself. In 1990, when Elisa was about a year old, Awilda began to show signs of turning her life around. After years of struggling with drug addiction, she reportedly entered a rehabilitation program. The rehabilitation process was challenging, but Awilda appeared to be getting better. By December of that same year, she had made sufficient strides in her recovery to regain custody of her 2 older children from previous relationships. This development was seen as a positive sign by social services, who interpreted it as evidence of Awilda's improving stability and capacity for parenting. However, Elisa remained in the full custody of her father. In 1991, Awilda took another significant step in her life by marrying a man named Carlos Lopez. Carlos, who worked as a security guard, was initially perceived as a stabilizing influence in Awilda's life. The couple moved into an apartment in Brooklyn, establishing what appeared to be a more settled domestic situation. This new family arrangement would later play a crucial role in the court's decisions regarding Elisa's custody. In November 1991, after months of legal deliberations, the court granted Awilda unsupervised visitation rights. The decision stipulated that Awilda would have custody of Elisa every second weekend. The implementation of the visitation schedule began in December 1991. The first few visits appeared to go smoothly, with Awilda presenting herself as a caring and attentive mother. She would pick Elisa up from Gustavo's apartment on Friday evenings and return her on Sunday afternoons. During these initial visits, Elisa seemed curious about her mother, but also displayed signs of anxiety about being separated from her father. And it was in the early stages of 1992 when issues began to surface. One particularly concerning incident occurred in March 1992, when Gustavo was giving Elisa a bath after a weekend visit with Awilda. He noticed bruising on Elisa's arms and legs. When gently questioned about the marks, Elisa became visibly distressed and refused to talk about what had happened. Alarmed by this discovery, Gustavo documented the bruises with photographs and reported the incident to Child Protective Services. The response from CPS was frustratingly inadequate. While they did conduct an investigation, interviewing both mother and father of Elisa, they ultimately concluded that there was insufficient evidence to substantiate the abuse claim. The investigators' report noted that Awilda had provided a plausible explanation for the bruises, claiming that the child had fallen while playing in a park. As 1992 went along, Elisa's behavior at school also began to change. Her teachers at the Montessori preschool, who had known Elisa since she was a toddler, noticed a noticeable difference in her demeanor. Barbara Simmons, one of Elisa's primary teachers, observed that Elisa had become more withdrawn in class. She no longer participated as enthusiastically in group activities and would sometimes sit alone during playtime. In May of that year, a particularly troubling incident occurred at the preschool. During a routine art activity, Elisa produced a drawing that caught her teacher's attention. The picture depicted a small figure, presumably Elisa, surrounded by dark, angry scribbles. When asked about the drawing, Elisa became visibly upset and said, "It's the dark place where mommy puts me." Alarmed by this statement, the teacher immediately reported it to the school principal and to CPS. This report triggered another investigation, but once again, the results were inconclusive. Awilda vehemently denied any wrongdoing and suggested that Elisa's imagination might be influenced by scary media such as movies. Without other evidence of abuse, the authorities were reluctant to take more decisive action. By the summer of 1992, Gustavo had become increasingly desperate to protect his daughter. He filed a petition with the family court to have Awilda's visitation rights revoked. In his filing, he detailed the behavioral changes he had observed in Elisa, the incident with the bruises, and the concerning report from her preschool. He also included statements from Elisa's teachers attesting to the changes they had witnessed in her behavior. The court hearing for this petition took place in August 1992. Gustavo presented his case, supported by testimony from Elisa's teachers and a child psychologist who had evaluated Elisa. The psychologist testified that Elisa showed signs of anxiety and trauma consistent with abuse, though she could not definitively state the source of this trauma. Awilda denied all allegations of abuse. She presented herself as a reformed mother who was deeply committed to rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Her attorney argued that the behavioral changes in Elisa were a normal reaction to the stress of divided custody and that severing the mother-daughter bond would be more harmful in the long run. While acknowledging Gustavo's concerns, the judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to completely revoke the visitation rights. However, recognizing the need for caution, the judge modified the order. Awilda's visits were to be supervised for a period of 6 months, after which the situation would be reevaluated. This ruling, while intended as a compromise, did little to alleviate the growing tensions. During these supervised visits, Elisa's behavior was noticeably different. She was often reluctant to engage with her mother, clinging to the social worker or asking repeatedly when she could return to her father. Additionally, Awilda seemed to struggle with interacting naturally with Elisa under the watchful eye of the supervisor. The social worker's reports from these visits noted the strained atmosphere and the child's apparent discomfort, but also acknowledged moments of positive interaction between them. As the supervised visitation period progressed, a new complication arose. In late 1992, Gustavo was diagnosed with cancer. Elisa sensed that something was wrong with her father and became increasingly anxious and clingy when in his presence. Gustavo continued to care for her as best he could, even on days when his energy was severely depleted by his illness and treatments. Concerned for Elisa's future, Gustavo planned to take her to Cuba in May 1994. He wanted to leave Elisa there permanently, where she would be looked after by his extended family, out of reach from Awilda. Tragically, Gustavo's declining health made this plan impossible to execute. As the planned travel date approached, it became clear that Gustavo was too ill to make the journey. In a cruel twist of fate, Gustavo passed away on the very day they were supposed to get on their flight to Cuba. As if the death was not enough, it also occurred before the court made a final decision on Gustavo's petition to limit the visitation rights of Elisa's mother further. In the wake of Gustavo's death, the custody battle for Elisa took a decisive turn. Awilda, who had been fighting for increased access to Elisa, now applied for full custody. Despite the concerns that had been raised about Awilda's treatment of Elisa during visitations, the court system was inclined to favor the biological mother's rights, and thus the transfer of Elisa from her father to her mother was granted. This is where Elisa's life saw a rapid decline. Upon gaining full custody, Awilda withdrew Elisa from her private school and enrolled her in a public one in Manhattan. At her new school, Elisa's behavior and appearance quickly raised concerns. She became withdrawn, emotionally disturbed, and uncommunicative. The school staff noticed that Elisa urinated frequently and had trouble walking. Most alarmingly, she bore numerous visible bruises and had begun tearing out sections of her own hair. On March 14, 1995, an anonymous letter was sent to Manhattan Child Welfare authorities, alerting them to Elisa's situation. The letter stated that Awilda Lopez had cut off much of Elisa's hair and had begun locking her in a dark room for extensive periods of time. This report should have triggered an immediate investigation, but no effective action was taken. Just 6 days after this letter was sent, on March 20th, Elisa was admitted to the hospital with a fractured shoulder. The injury had been left untreated for 3 days, days before medical attention was sought. This incident represented a clear escalation in the physical abuse Elisa was enduring and another missed opportunity for intervention by CPS. As the abuse intensified, Elisa's mother withdrew her from school entirely and did not allow her out of the house. According to officials, the abuse was not limited to just hitting. The victim was also forced to consume her own waste and drink ammoniated water. Awilda also forced Elisa to do household chores, and if they weren't completed to her standards, Elisa would face punishment. This came in various forms, but one of the most brutal were the burns that Awilda inflicted. This poor excuse for a mother also subjected Elisa to sexual abuse through the use of various items, including hairbrushes and toothbrushes. There were even several occasions where neighbors would report hearing someone shouting for help from Awilda's residence. These acts that Elisa suffered were not limited to her mother alone. Her partner, Carlos Lopez, also participated in the abuse and neglect of Elisa and her siblings. However, it was noted that Awilda targeted Elisa for almost all of the abuse she inflicted, despite having 6 children in total. Fast forward to November 15, 1995, Carlos Lopez was jailed for violating his parole agreement. This left Awilda all alone with the children, exacerbating an already volatile situation. On the evening of November 22nd of the same year, Awilda made a phone call to her sister, Mercy Torres, with dire news. She described Elisa as being, quote, like on the bed, not eating, drinking, or using the bathroom. Most alarmingly, Awilda reported fluid leaking from Elisa's nose and mouth, which was later determined to be brain fluid. This should have prompted immediate medical attention. However, when Mercy urged that the girl be taken to the hospital, Awilda's response was disturbingly casual. She said she would think about it after she finished washing the dishes. The following morning, Awilda contacted a neighbor inviting him to view Elisa's body. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Elisa motionless. He placed his hand on her cold forehead and realized she was dead. What followed was a 2-hour period during which the neighbor pleaded with Awilda to call the police. She refused, suggesting she was aware of the gravity of her actions. Eventually, the neighbor made the call himself. When the police arrived, Awilda confessed to killing Elisa. She admitted to throwing her daughter against a concrete wall 2 days prior on November 21st. According to her, Elisa had neither talked nor walked after this incident. This confession reveals that the child had been in critical condition for at least 2 days before her death, during which time no medical help was sought. Elisa's funeral, held on November 29th, drew around 300 mourners, including relatives, neighbors, politicians, and Prince Michael of Greece. This case received a response of outrage from the public, sparking criticism of New York's child welfare agencies and the judicial system. On June 25, 1996, Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years to life imprisonment. She was eventually released from Taconic Correctional Facility on April 19, 2022. Elisa's stepfather, Carlos Lopez, was sentenced on October 29, 1996, to serve between 1.5 and 3 years in prison for a specific instance of physical abuse.